A big piece of the fallout now, though, is what happens to the best roster in the nation per the 24/7 Sports Talent Composite? Well, Grace Remington is with our portal expert, Chris Hummer. Hey, guys.
Yeah, Emily, I was about to say the coaching dominoes aren't the only ones we're waiting to fall. This roster could be picked apart. Chris Hummer, our transfer portal expert, joins me with more. Now, we know the rule: anytime a coach leaves the program, that opens a 30-day window for current players on the roster to transfer out of the program. The catch-22 of that is if Alabama has an exodus, they can't replace those players until April, when the second transfer portal window opens. So walk us through what this process might look like, and how do you think it'll impact Alabama in 2024?
Well, it's an interesting time for Alabama. Classes have started around the country at a lot of schools. So in that way, it is a good time for Alabama to make this change, because it's harder for a player to leave and transfer immediately and enroll somewhere else. So that's a positive for Alabama. At the same time, it's very difficult for Alabama to replace anybody who leaves, at least until April. Not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things when you look towards the 2024 season. There are going to be more players who enter the portal. But Alabama already missed a very big first wave of players who were interested in going other places. So that pool of players is off the table if those players leave. So retention is going to be a key for Alabama over the next couple of days, over the next couple of weeks, as that 30-day window goes about. And people are already trying to poach. It's just the reality of the situation. I know somebody close to an Alabama player that received multiple phone calls last night in the wake of the Nick Saban news, and I'm sure it's a very similar situation for a lot of players. So it's going to be a very interesting couple weeks for the new head coach when they come in, because his first and his main priority is going to be retention. It's not going to be recruiting 2025. It's going to be retaining the roster. That's the key. Alabama's a national title quality roster. They have to keep that roster intact.
Yeah, and that 2023 roster ranked as the top roster in our 24/7 Sports Talent Composite rankings. It was actually the highest rated ever in the history of our composite rankings. So which players do you think are a possibility to be poached?
Well, I would say off the top, I talked to somebody in the program today. They think for the most part, players are going to stick around at least until the new head coach gets there. Part of Nick Saban's message to players was give us 72 hours. Let's see what we can come up with. That was the idea of the meeting. And I think just talking to people around that program over the last 24 hours, there is a sense team leaders have rallied the program, and kids will mostly stay put for now. That said, there are a lot of Alabama players during the last transfer portal window that considered their options. I think a really good example here is Caden Proctor, true freshman All-American left tackle, one of the best players in the 2023 class. He is somebody that was considering his options as a possible transfer following the Rose Bowl. Those are conversations that happened. That was a pretty aggressive rumor there. He ultimately stayed, but now he has a full 30-day window to consider his options again. And you could say that about every single player on Alabama's roster. And from that perspective, you're going to have basically every single player on Alabama's roster as a potential starter elsewhere. The people in Alabama's 3 deep could start most places in the Power 5. So you're going to have a lot of teams coming after them. So it's just going to be critical for Alabama to manage that as much as they can.
And it's not just the game day experienced players that can transfer out. Members of this 2024 recruiting class that ranks number 2 in the country currently could also leave. There are 21 current enrollees at Tuscaloosa right now. We've already seen a verbal decommit from 5-star wide receiver Ryan Williams. And it was interesting reading his quotes, because he said when Bama lost the wide receiver coach, didn't affect him as much. But he was shocked to hear the Saban news. He said, now that's a legacy you're losing. So it's a little bit more poignant to these guys. What do you expect to see from the 2024 players?
Well, it's just an interesting time for them, and I've used the word interesting a couple times. And it's frankly not just interesting. This is unprecedented in college football. You've never had a coach of this stature leave at a time like this. There's never been a time in college football history when a coach of Nick Saban's stature and his historical significance in the game has left, and his players have the opportunity to do so as well. College football rules have been restrictive for a long time, and now it kind of works against Alabama that so many players enrolled early, because they can just hop in the portal and leave with no approval from Alabama. They don't have to get out of their national letter of intent. So these players have a lot of flexibility. If you're Alabama, a guy like Julian Sand, their 5-star quarterback take from this class, he's from California, came to Alabama in part to play for Nick Saban, like so many of these guys do. You have to hang on to him. He is an out-of-region player. Alabama was able to get Julian Sand in large part because of what Alabama has built. Now that 2024 class, just like the rest of the roster, has the opportunity to leave. And Alabama, again, retention is the word of the day for Alabama moving forward. You have to retain your roster. and they're going to have to fight to keep a lot of these guys.
Retention is key. That's a phrase you keep repeating, and that depends on several factors. One of them is the way Alabama handles its NIL. They do it a little differently than most schools, typically merit-based for the young guys. So how important is it for Alabama to get the NIL together to keep this roster?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about NIL with Alabama. Nick Saban has had a pretty significant way of molding that program. He wanted it to be merit-based. I think that works in large sense because Nick Saban was there. You know, if you go to Alabama, you compete for a national championship. Now that that piece of things is out the window, you think you're probably going to compete for a national championship with that roster, but it's not a guarantee. Now Alabama's going to have to fundraise a little more aggressively from NIL. They're going to have to be a little more aggressive in the NIL landscape because you cannot rely on Nick Saban to hold things together in that way. So it'll be very interesting to see how Alabama managed to activate that side of things. There are very aggressive schools out there from an NIL standpoint. I think about Oregon, I think about Texas, I think about Miami. Alabama isn't necessarily in that stratosphere yet in terms of NIL, and they'll have to be soon to keep this roster intact, I think.
There's a lot of moving pieces. Thank you, Chris. Our entire team is keeping you up to date with all the Alabama news. Head over to 247sports.com for transfer portal news, crystal ball predictions, player grades, and the latest around the entire college football world. That's 247sports.com.